I'm 79 years old, and I heard my daughter-in-law ask why I was still alive. Let me say that again, because even now, months later, those words still cut like a knife through butter. I heard my son's wife wonder out loud why I hadn't died yet, as if I was milked past its expiration date, as if my 79 years on this earth were somehow an inconvenience to her schedule. My name is Vivian Ashford. I've lived through the Kennedy assassination. Walked on floors the day after man walked on the moon. Buried a husband I loved for 43 years. Raised 4 children in a 3-bedroom house with 1 bathroom, and built a life I was proud of. I thought I'd earned respect. I thought I'd earned love. I certainly thought I'd earned the right to live without someone calculating how much longer I'd be in the way. But that Saturday afternoon in June, during my own 79th birthday party, while I rested in my bedroom because these old bones get tired easily, I learned exactly what my son Derek and his wife Melissa really thought of me. The window was open to catch the breeze, and their voices drifted up from the backyard like poison gas. I'm going to tell you everything that happened after that moment. How I went from being a grandmother who baked cookies and babysat grandchildren to a woman fighting for her very survival. How I discovered that the family I'd sacrificed everything for had been planning my death like it was a business transaction. And how this helpless old lady taught them the most expensive lesson of their lives. If you want to hear how a 79-year-old woman outsmarted people who thought her age made her weak, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, because this story has more twists than the mystery novels I've been reading since before most of you were born. And trust me, you won't believe where this goes. Because when Melissa asked why I was still alive, she had no idea she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. The party continued downstairs. I could hear laughter, the clink of glasses, someone asking where I'd gone. My daughter Linda called up the stairs that they were about to cut the cake. But I couldn't move. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands trembling, staring at the wallpaper I'd hung myself in 1987. Why is she even still alive? That's what Melissa had said, her voice sharp and impatient, drifting up through my open bedroom window like smoke from a fire I couldn't see but could definitely smell. I forced myself to stand, legs shaky, and moved closer to the window. I needed to hear this. I needed to know if I'd misunderstood, if maybe my old ears were playing tricks on me. At 79, you start doubting yourself. People treat you like you're confused, like your memory is slipping, like you don't quite understand things anymore. But my hearing was just fine. Melissa's voice came through clearly, impatient and cold. She told Derek they were drowning in debt. She mentioned my age again, almost 80, she said, like it was some kind of terminal diagnosis they were waiting to cash in on. Then she said something that made my blood turn to ice. She mentioned my will. She knew the exact amount. $1.8 million, divided 4 ways between my children. $450,000 for them. I'd worked my entire life for that money. My husband and I had scraped and saved, invested carefully, lived modestly. We'd bought this house in 1973 for $38,000. Now it was worth over $1 million alone. The rest was in stocks, bonds, savings accounts we'd built over 50 years of marriage and 10 years of my widowhood. And my son's wife was standing in my backyard, at my birthday party, calculating how much longer she'd have to wait for me to die. Then I heard another voice. Jason, Melissa's brother. I'd always thought he was a bit of a leech, always around when Derek and Melissa hosted dinners, always with his hand out. He told Melissa that I'd lived a complete life. He said it wasn't like I was doing anything productive anymore. Productive. At 70, as if my worth as a human being was measured by what I could produce. My hand found my cell phone on the nightstand. I don't know what made me do it, maybe instinct from watching too many crime shows. Maybe some survival mechanism kicking in, but I opened the voice recording app. My granddaughter had shown me how to use it last Christmas when I wanted to record the carol singing. I pressed record and held the phone near the window. What came next? I wish I could unhear. Melissa's voice dropped lower, more conspiratorial. She asked Derek if he'd thought about accelerating things. She mentioned my medications. I take 5 different pills every day for blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol. She said it would be so easy to confuse dosages. She said that for a woman of 79 with high blood pressure and diabetes, it would look completely natural. I stopped breathing. My own son's wife was discussing how to murder me at my birthday party, while people sang and ate cake downstairs. Derek's response was weak, telling her to shut up, saying they couldn't talk about this. But he didn't sound shocked. He didn't sound horrified. He sounded like a man who'd heard this before and was just tired of discussing it in public. Then Jason laughed. Actually laughed. He said that accidents happen all the time. He said elderly people fall downstairs constantly. I recorded for 15 more minutes. Melissa detailed how waxed stairs would be fatal. Apparently, she'd researched this. Derek eventually admitted it would be a solution to all their problems. All their problems. That's what I was, a problem to be solved. When I finally went back downstairs, I made sure my face showed nothing but the sweet, confused grandmother they expected to see. I exclaimed over the beautiful cake Melissa had made. I told everyone these old legs needed so much rest these days. I let them pat my hand and tell me to take it easy. And while they smiled at me, while Derek kissed my cheek and Melissa refilled my coffee, I had 15 minutes of audio saved in 3 different cloud accounts, backed up and protected, because I may be 79 years old, but I'm not stupid, and I'm certainly not ready to die. Monday morning, I had an appointment to make, not with my regular doctor, and definitely not with my family. I needed a different kind of help entirely, the kind that would keep me alive long enough to make them regret ever asking why I was still breathing. Monday morning, I told my daughter Linda I had a doctor's appointment. She offered to drive me. Sweet Linda, always so caring, but I told her I'd take an Uber. I'd learned how to use the app 6 months ago, and let me tell you, it felt like freedom having a driver at my fingertips without having to burden my children. Except now, I knew that at least one of my children saw me as a burden worth eliminating. The Uber dropped me off at an office building downtown, 3rd floor, suite 304. Arthur Brennan, attorney at law, specializing in elder abuse and exploitation. I'd found him through a support group website at 2 a.m. Sunday night. After lying awake replaying that recording over and over until I'd memorized every horrible word, Arthur was younger than I expected, maybe 50. With kind eyes that reminded me of my late husband. He offered me tea and didn't rush me when it took a moment to settle into the chair. These joints aren't what they used to be. When I played him the recording, his face went from concern to absolutely grim. He told me this wasn't just family drama or hurt feelings. He said the words, conspiracy to commit murder, and suddenly everything felt very real and very terrifying. Here I'd been thinking maybe I could talk to Derek. Maybe this was all Melissa's influence. Maybe my son wasn't really serious. But Arthur explained that Derek's admission on tape that it would solve all their problems, combined with the detailed planning about medication dosages and staged accidents, constituted criminal intent. He said if they acted on any of it, they'd go to prison for a very long time. If they acted on it, if I was still alive to see justice. That's when Arthur suggested I meet with someone else. A private investigator named Sandra Kim, who specialized in building cases against family members exploiting or endangering elderly relatives. He said she could help me stay safe while gathering more evidence, because audio alone might not be enough to prove they'd actually attempt anything. I met Sandra that same afternoon. She was sharp, efficient, probably in her 40s, and she didn't treat me like I was fragile. She listened to the recording twice, asked pointed questions about my daily routine, my medication schedule, who had keys to my house, who knew my alarm code. Then she laid out something that made my stomach drop. She explained that we needed to create opportunities for them to act. We needed to catch them actually attempting to harm me, not just talking about it. She said she could install discreet surveillance throughout my house, cameras so small I'd never notice them, recording everything. She said we'd need to make me appear more vulnerable, more trusting, more accessible to them. Basically, I needed to become bait in a trap designed to catch my own son and his wife trying to kill me. I sat there in her office, looking at this woman half my age telling me I needed to risk my life to prove my family wanted to take it, and I thought about just walking away, maybe moving somewhere else, maybe changing my will and cutting Derek out and just living whatever years I had left in peace. But then I remembered Melissa's voice, that cold calculation, the way she'd said I'd lived long enough, like my existence past 80 was somehow greedy of me. I told Sandra to do it. Over the next 3 days, while I was supposedly visiting my sister in Phoenix, Sandra's team installed cameras in every room of my house. Tiny things hidden in smoke detectors, picture frames, even the thermostat. They were motion activated and uploaded directly to a secure cloud server that only Sandra, Arthur, and I could access. But Sandra had one more suggestion, and this one was brilliant in a way that made me almost admire her cunning. She told me to leave a fake will somewhere Melissa would find it. Something that showed Derek inheriting significantly more than his siblings, maybe 60% instead of 25%, make the bait irresistible. Make them think that keeping me alive a little longer, or getting rid of me sooner would mean the difference between financial ruin and wealth. So I created a document on my computer, made it look official, and printed it out. I left it in my desk drawer, not hidden but not obvious either, the kind of place someone snooping would definitely look. The fake will showed Derek receiving $1.08 million, more than a million reasons to want me dead sooner rather than later. Then I came home from my trip and called Derek. I told him I'd had such a wonderful time with his aunt, but the travel had tired me out terribly. I mentioned feeling a bit dizzy, a bit confused about my medication schedule. I wondered aloud if maybe Melissa, who was so organized, might help me sort out my pills for the week. Derek jumped at the offer. He said Melissa would love to help, that I shouldn't worry about anything, that they'd take care of me. Take care of me. Those words used to mean something different. 3 days later, Sandra called me with news that made my hands shake so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. The cameras had caught Melissa entering my house with a key I'd never given her. She'd made a copy somehow, probably months ago. She'd gone straight to my bedroom, photographed all my medication bottles, and then searched my desk. She'd found the fake will. Sandra had footage of Melissa's face when she read it. And even through a tiny camera lens, I could see the greed light up her eyes like Christmas morning. But here's what made me realize just how deep this went. After Melissa found that will, she didn't leave. She stood in my bedroom for almost 10 minutes, looking around, and Sandra said her expression was calculating, measuring, like she was planning something. 2 days after that, Melissa called and offered to organize my medications for me. Said she'd noticed I seemed confused lately and she wanted to help. Her voice was so sweet, so concerned, exactly the way a loving daughter-in-law should sound. I told her that would be wonderful and invited her over that afternoon. When she left an hour later, with my pills all sorted into a weekly organizer she'd brought, I waited exactly 10 minutes before calling Sandra. The investigator came over immediately with a medical testing kit. We tested every single pill in that organizer. What we found made me realize that my son's wife wasn't just talking about killing me. She'd already started trying. The test results came back from the lab on a Thursday afternoon. Sandra brought them to my house personally, and I could see from her face that it was bad. Melissa had doubled my warfarin dosage. Warfarin, that's the blood thinner I take to prevent strokes. At my age, with my medical history, doubling that medication could cause internal bleeding, fatal internal bleeding. And she'd increased my blood pressure medication too, a combination that Sandra's medical consultant said could trigger a hemorrhagic stroke. I held those lab reports in my hands, staring at the numbers, and something inside me went very cold and very calm. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't just ugly words in a backyard. My daughter-in-law had literally prepared medications designed to kill me, smiled to my face, and handed them over while telling me how much she cared about my well-being. Sandra explained what we needed to do next. I had to pretend to take those pills. I had to act like the overdose was working, show symptoms, complain about dizziness, maybe even stage a dramatic fall or two, make them think their plan was succeeding. All while cameras captured everything and I secretly disposed of the actual poisoned medications. She also told me something that made me sick to my stomach. Her team had been monitoring Melissa's computer and phone, all legal with the warrants Arthur had secured based on the original recording, and they'd found search history that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Melissa had researched how long warfarin overdose takes to kill someone. She'd looked up symptoms of internal bleeding in elderly patients. She'd visited forums where she asked anonymous questions about medication interactions, always carefully framing them as asking for a relative she was caring for. My son's wife had been planning my murder with the same thoroughness other people use to plan birthday parties. That Sunday, Derek and Melissa came over for dinner. I'd invited them, played the loving mother who just wanted family time. I made pot roast, Derek's favorite since he was 8 years old. I set the table with my good china, the set my mother gave me in 1964, and I performed. I took the pills from the organizer Melissa had prepared, made a show of swallowing them with water. Then I excused myself to the kitchen and spit them into a napkin when no one was looking. Throughout dinner, I complained about feeling lightheaded. I knocked over my water glass on purpose. though I made it look like my hand just trembled. I asked Derek the same question twice, pretending I'd forgotten I'd already asked. The look that passed between Derek and Melissa was like watching vultures spot a dying animal. Melissa rushed to help me, so solicitous, so concerned. She suggested I should rest more. She offered to check in on me daily. She said she'd make sure I was taking my medications properly. Derek sat there and let her say all of it. My son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep 1,000 nights, the child I'd sat up with when he had nightmares, just nodded along while his wife pretended to care if I lived or died. Over the next week, I escalated the performance. I called Linda and told her I'd had a dizzy spell. I mentioned to my neighbor that I'd felt confused lately. I even went to my actual doctor with Sandra's coaching and described symptoms consistent with medication issues. The doctor ran tests that showed everything was actually fine, because I wasn't really taking the poisoned pills, but the complaints were now on record. All of this was building a timeline, a paper trail showing that after Melissa took over my medication management, my health suddenly declined. Meanwhile, the cameras captured everything. They recorded Melissa entering my house 3 more times when I was supposedly at doctor's appointments. Each time, she went through my things. She photographed documents, checked my bank statements, even opened my safe. I'd deliberately left it unlocked with the fake will inside. But the most damning footage came from her own house. See, Sandra's team had gotten creative. They couldn't legally put cameras inside Derek and Melissa's home, but they could monitor what was visible through windows from the street. And they could track any computer activity on devices Melissa used while connected to my Wi-Fi when she visited. The computer monitoring revealed that Melissa was researching symptoms of internal hemorrhaging. She'd looked up how long it typically takes for elderly patients to die from stroke complications. She'd even searched for how to act bereaved at funeral and inheritance tax calculator. She was planning my death and my funeral simultaneously. Then came the moment that proved just how stupid they thought I was. Melissa showed up one afternoon with homemade tea, said she'd made a special blend to help with my dizziness, something with ginger and honey. She was so sweet about it, insisting I drink it while it was hot, standing right there in my kitchen watching me with those cold eyes. I thanked her profusely, told her what a thoughtful daughter-in-law she was, and made a show of taking several sips while she watched. The moment she left, I poured the entire cup into a sealed container Sandra had given me for exactly this purpose. The toxicology report came back 48 hours later. That tea contained a massive dose of Ambien mixed with tripled warfarin. The lab technician told Sandra that amount, given my age and weight, would have almost certainly killed me within 24 hours. I would have gone to sleep and never woken up. Massive internal bleeding while unconscious. My daughter-in-law had served me a cup of death and watched me drink it with a smile on her face. That night, I sat alone in my house, the one I'd lived in for 52 years, where I'd raised my babies and buried my husband and built a life, and I let myself cry for the first time since this nightmare began, not from fear anymore, from grief. I grieved for the son I thought I'd raised. I grieved for the family I thought I had. I grieved for the grandmother I'd been just 3 weeks ago, when my biggest worry was whether my tomato plants would survive the heat. But when I was done crying, I dried my eyes and called Arthur. I told him I was ready. We had enough evidence. It was time to end this. He agreed, but he wanted to do it right. He wanted to make sure when we brought the hammer down, it came down so hard they'd never get back up. So we planned the family dinner. All 4 of my children, their spouses, and as a surprise, Arthur, Sandra, and 2 detectives from the district attorney's office who'd been building the criminal case. I sent out the invitations myself. Told everyone I wanted to celebrate family. That at my age you never know how many dinners you have left. Melissa responded within an hour. She said she wouldn't miss it for the world. I'm sure she wouldn't. She probably thought she'd be measuring my coffin by next week. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday night, 2 weeks away. That gave us time to make absolutely certain our case was airtight. Arthur explained that we weren't just trying to scare them or teach them a lesson. We were building a criminal prosecution for attempted murder. One mistake, one piece of evidence that could be challenged, and they might walk free. I couldn't let that happen. During those 2 weeks, I continued my performance. I became the confused, declining grandmother they expected to see. I called Derek twice, asking if we'd already talked that day. I told Linda I couldn't remember where I'd put my car keys, even though I'd stopped driving 6 months ago. I mentioned to my neighbor that sometimes I felt like someone had been in my house, but then I'd laugh it off as senior moments, all of it on purpose, all of it building a narrative that I was becoming vulnerable, fading, no longer sharp enough to notice what was happening around me. But behind that mask, I was working with Sandra and Arthur like we were preparing for war. Sandra installed even more sophisticated monitoring equipment, not just cameras now, but audio recording devices that could pick up whispered conversations. She set up systems to track every time someone entered my house, every time my computer was accessed, every time my phone received a call or text. We discovered that Melissa had tried to access my bank accounts online 3 times. She didn't get in. My passwords were stronger than she expected, probably because my granddaughter had helped me set them up, but the attempts were logged and traceable. Arthur, meanwhile, was building the legal case with a precision that reminded me why I'd chosen him. He compiled everything: the original recording from my birthday party, the surveillance footage of Melissa entering my home without permission, the toxicology reports on the poisoned medications in tea, her internet search history, the fake will that showed her motive. But he wanted more. He wanted to understand why. So he had Sandra dig into Derek and Melissa's finances, and what we found explained everything in the ugliest possible way. They weren't just in debt, they were drowning. Derek had lost his job 8 months ago, something he'd never told me. He'd been pretending to go to work every day, while actually desperately searching for something new. Melissa had maxed out 4 credit cards trying to maintain their lifestyle: the big house in the nice neighborhood, the luxury cars, the private school for their daughter. They owed over $300,000 in consumer debt alone. Their mortgage was underwater. They'd taken out a home equity line of credit they couldn't afford, and they'd borrowed $50,000 from Melissa's brother Jason, the same Jason who'd laughed about elderly people falling downstairs at a loan shark interest rate they'd never be able to repay. They were financially destroyed, and I was the life insurance policy they were waiting to cash in. Arthur showed me Derek's text messages to Melissa from 4 months ago, obtained through the warrant. My son had written that they just needed to hold on a little longer, that his mother was old, and it wouldn't be much longer naturally. Melissa had responded asking why they should wait for nature when they could help things along. For months they'd been planning this, for at least 4 months. I thought about all the times Derek had visited during those months. The way he'd hug me and ask about my health. The concerned looks when I mentioned feeling tired. All of it had been them watching me, waiting, hoping I'd just die on my own so they wouldn't have to get their hands dirty. And when I didn't die fast enough, Melissa decided to take action. Sandra discovered something else that made the picture even clearer. Melissa had been researching lawyers who specialized in contesting wills. She'd had a consultation recorded in an email asking hypothetically if a will could be challenged if the deceased had been showing signs of dementia or confusion before death. She was planning ahead. Kill me, then argued that my will wasn't valid because I'd been mentally incompetent. Try to get Derek an even bigger share than the fake will promised. My daughter-in-law wasn't just trying to murder me. She was trying to rob my other children of their inheritance too. I called Linda, my eldest, and my 2 other sons, Marcus and James, and asked them to come over individually. I needed to tell them what was happening before the dinner. They deserved to know, and I needed them there as witnesses to whatever went down. Linda arrived first. Sweet Linda, who called me every Sunday without fail, who brought her children over every month to bake cookies with Grandma. When I told her, when I played her the recordings and showed her the evidence, she went pale and then she cried. She kept saying she couldn't believe Derek would do this, that he loved me, that there must be some mistake. But then I showed her the text messages, the search histories, the poisoned medications, and I watched my daughter's face transform from disbelief to horror to rage. Marcus and James had similar reactions. Marcus, who'd always looked up to Derek as the responsible older brother, looked like I'd punched him in the stomach. James, the youngest at 47, actually asked if I was sure, if maybe I'd misunderstood somehow. I was sure. I'd spent 79 years on this earth learning to read people, and I was absolutely certain my oldest son and his wife were trying to kill me for money. We talked for hours that day, my 3 loyal children and I. They wanted to confront Derek immediately, but Arthur had advised against it. We needed everything to happen at the dinner, with witnesses, with law enforcement present. Clean and legal and absolutely devastating. Linda asked me something that had been haunting me too. What would I do with Derek's share of my inheritance after this was over? I'd been thinking about that a lot. At first, I'd wanted to leave him nothing, not a single penny. But Arthur had suggested something more pointed, more meaningful. Leave him exactly enough to restart his life after prison, but not nearly enough to make any of this worth it. Make him live with the knowledge that he'd destroyed his relationship with his mother, thrown away his freedom, torn apart his family, all for money he could have had anyway if he'd just been patient and let me live my life. But there was something else I wanted to do with my money, something this nightmare had inspired. I told Arthur to set aside $300,000 to establish a foundation, the Vivian Ashford Foundation for Elder Protection. It would provide legal assistance and private investigation services for elderly people who suspected they were being exploited or endangered by family members, because I knew now that I wasn't alone. How many other 79-year-old women were out there with children or grandchildren just waiting for them to die? How many were being slowly poisoned, isolated, manipulated, their confusion dismissed as age instead of abuse? If I was going to survive this, if I was going to come out the other side, then something good needed to come from it. The day before the dinner, Sandra did a final sweep of my house. Every camera was functioning. Every recording device was ready. Arthur had briefed the detectives who would be attending. We had a plan for how the evening would unfold, what would be said, when the evidence would be presented. I ironed my best tablecloth, the one I'd used for every major family dinner for 30 years. I polished the silver my husband's mother had given us as a wedding present in 1966. I prepared a menu pot roast again, because Derek loved it, and maybe some part of me wanted him to remember his favorite meal as the night his life fell apart. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the boy Derek had been, the one who'd held my hand on his first day of kindergarten, the one who'd cried when his hamster died and I'd helped him bury it in the backyard, the one who'd told me at his high school graduation that everything he'd achieved was because of me. Where had that boy gone? When had my son become someone who could discuss my death like it was a business transaction? Or maybe he'd always been capable of it, and I just hadn't wanted to see it. Saturday arrived with perfect weather, sunny and warm, the kind of day that should have been filled with joy instead of what I was about to do. I set the table for 11. My 4 children and their spouses, plus Arthur, Sandra, and the 2 detectives. I'd told my family the extra guests were old friends surprising me. Derek and Melissa had no idea what was coming. At 6 o'clock, the doorbell started ringing. It was time to serve the coldest dish I'd ever prepared, revenge, with a side of justice. 79 years in the making. Linda arrived first, at 5:30, to help me with final preparations. She was quiet, moving through my kitchen like she was in a dream. Every few minutes she'd look at me with these heartbroken eyes, and I knew what she was thinking. How do you process that your older brother tried to murder your mother? Marcus and James came together at 5:45, their wives with them. Both my daughters-in-law looked confused. I told them this was just a family dinner, nothing more. They'd find out soon enough why the evening felt so heavy, why their husbands were so tense. Then Derek and Melissa arrived, right at 6 o'clock, punctual as always. Melissa was carrying flowers, chrysanthemums, which I've always hated but she's given me every year, regardless, and Derek had a bottle of wine. They both kissed my cheek and Derek told me I looked well, which was interesting considering his wife had been trying to make sure I'd never look well again. I thanked them and ushered everyone into the living room. Arthur, Sandra, and the 2 detectives introduced as old friends Arthur and Sandra, and their colleagues Michael and Jennifer, were already seated. I watched Derek's face when he saw them. Just a flicker of confusion, quickly covered. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly, but she smiled and shook hands like the gracious guest she pretended to be. We made small talk for 15 minutes. The detectives were in plain clothes, nothing to suggest they were law enforcement. They chatted about the weather, complimented my house, asked polite questions about my family. All the while, I could see Melissa relaxing, deciding these were just boring old friends of mine, nothing to worry about. She had no idea she was sitting in a room with the people who'd spent 2 weeks documenting her attempts to kill me. When we moved to the dining room, I'd arranged the seating very deliberately. Derek at the head of the table opposite me, Melissa to his right, Arthur to my right, Sandra to my left. The detectives positioned where they could see everyone clearly. My other children scattered between, witnesses to what was about to unfold. I served the pot roast and we ate. People complimented the food. Melissa mentioned that I seemed so much better than I had been lately, more alert, less confused. She said it with such false warmth that I had to grip my fork tighter to keep my hand from shaking. After Dazuchapol pie, made from my mother's recipe that I'd been making for 55 years, stood up slowly. Everyone went quiet, expecting maybe a toast or a little speech about family. Instead, I said I had something important to discuss. Derek smiled, probably thinking I was about to announce some change to my routine. Maybe that I needed more help around the house, more opportunities for them to access my medications. I looked directly at him and told him I knew everything. The room went absolutely still. I said I knew about the conversation at my birthday party. I knew about the planning, the research, the medication tampering, the poisoned tea. I said I had evidence of all of it, and that evidence was about to be turned over to law enforcement. Then I nodded to Arthur. He stood up and formally introduced himself and Sandra, explaining their roles. The two detectives produced their badges and identified themselves as representatives from the district attorney's office. Melissa's face went from tan to white in about 3 seconds. Arthur pulled out his laptop and began playing the original recording from my birthday party. Melissa's voice filled my dining room. Why is she even still alive? Then the discussion about medication overdoses, about staged accidents, about waxed stairs. Derek tried to interrupt, saying I'd misunderstood, taken things out of context. But Arthur just kept playing, Derek's own voice admitting it would solve all their problems. Jason's laughter about elderly people falling downstairs. When the recording ended, Sandra took over. She brought up footage on her tablet. Melissa entering my house with an unauthorized key, going through my desk, photographing my medications, time-stamped and dated, crystal clear. Then came the toxicology reports. Arthur read them out loud, clinical and precise. The doubled warfarin, the increased blood pressure medication, the tea that contained enough Ambien and blood thinners to kill me in my sleep. My other children were staring at Derek and Melissa with expressions I'd never seen before. Linda had tears streaming down her face. Marcus looked like he might be sick. James just kept shaking his head, over and over. Derek tried to defend himself. He said he'd never actually done anything, that it was all Melissa, that he'd just been going along with her talk but never intended for anything to actually happen. But Sandra had more evidence. She showed his text messages from 4 months ago, discussing how much longer they'd have to wait for me to die naturally. She showed internet searches from his phone, not just Melissa's, looking up inheritance tax laws and life expectancy tables for women my age. My son had been researching how much longer I was statistically likely to live. Like I was a bond reaching maturity. Then came the financial records. Sandra projected them on my dining room wall, numbers that told the story of their desperation. The debts, the lies about Derek's job, the house of cards that was about to collapse and take them with it. Arthur explained that this wasn't just about hurt feelings or family drama. He said the words conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder with special circumstances and elder abuse with intent to kill. He said that based on California law, they were looking at 15 years to life. That's when Melissa finally broke. She started screaming, called me a manipulative old bitch, said I'd set them up, that I'd played sick on purpose to trap them. She said I should be grateful someone was willing to put me out of my misery, that I was just wasting space and money at 79, that I was a burden on everyone. The detectives were recording everything. Every word Melissa screamed was being captured. And Arthur would later tell me that her outburst was actually the best thing that could have happened for the prosecution. She'd essentially confessed while also establishing motive and showing lack of remorse. She told the room that I deserved to die because I was old and useless. She said my money was being wasted on someone who was just waiting to die anyway. She called my age a burden, my existence an inconvenience. And she said all of this in front of witnesses, law enforcement, and recording devices, while my other children watched their brother's wife reveal exactly what kind of person she really was. Derek tried to quiet her, but it was too late. She'd already admitted to everything, the planning, the execution, the poisoning, the fake concern for my well-being. She'd admitted it all while calling me a manipulative old woman, as if my refusal to be murdered made me the villain in this story. One of the detectives stood up and informed Melissa she was under arrest for attempted murder. He read her rights while she screamed that this was entrapment, that I'd forced her hand, that none of it would have happened if I'd just died when I was supposed to, as if there was a deadline on my life that I'd rudely missed. They handcuffed her right there in my dining room. The The same room where we'd celebrated Christmases and Thanksgivings and birthdays for decades. The same room where she'd sat at my table, eaten my food, and smiled at me while planning my death. Then the detective turned to Derek and told him he needed to come down to the station for questioning. Derek looked at me for the first time all night hand, said he was sorry, that he never meant for it to go this far, but I'd heard the recordings. I'd seen the text messages. I'd read his internet searches about how much money he'd inherit when I died. My son had meant for it to go exactly this far. He'd just never meant to get caught. As they led Melissa out in handcuffs, still screaming, still calling me names, my other children sat in stunned silence. The perfect family dinner had turned into a crime scene, exactly as I'd planned. Arthur gathered up his evidence. Sandra packed away her equipment. The detectives took statements from everyone present, and I sat at my dining room table, surrounded by the remains of pot roast and apple pie, and thought about how I'd just watched my eldest son's life implode because he couldn't wait a few more years for an inheritance he'd get anyway. Linda came over and hugged me, crying into my shoulder. She kept apologizing, like Derek's actions were somehow her fault. Marcus and James just looked shell-shocked, unable to process what their brother had done. Before he left, Arthur told me that the district attorney's office was moving forward with prosecution immediately. With the evidence we had, he said convictions were almost certain. He asked if I was prepared for trial, for everything that would come next. I told him I'd survived 79 years, 2 wars, the death of my husband, and a daughter-in-law trying to poison me. I could survive a trial. What I didn't say was that the hardest part was still coming, because a trial would be public and temporary, and eventually over. But living with the knowledge that I'd raised a son who valued money more than my life, that was a sentence with no end date. The days after the dinner felt surreal. My house, which had been filled with hidden cameras and recording devices, suddenly felt empty even though the equipment was still there. Sandra said we should keep it active until the trial was over, just in case Derek or Melissa's family tried anything stupid. I didn't sleep much that first week. I'd lie awake replaying everything, wondering if I could have handled it differently, if there was some moment where I could have reached Derek before it got this far. But then I'd remember Melissa's voice asking why I was still alive, and I'd know there was nothing I could have done differently. Some people are just willing to kill for money. That's a truth I'd learned at 79 years old. Arthur called 3 days after the arrests to update me. Derek had been released on bail, $250,000 that he'd somehow scraped together, probably by mortgaging whatever equity they had left in that house. Melissa was still in custody because her charges were more severe, and her brother Jason had fled the state the moment he heard about the arrests, which made her a flight risk. Good, let her sit in a cell and think about what she'd done. Derek's lawyer had reached out to Arthur with a deal proposal. Derek wanted to testify against Melissa in exchange for reduced charges. He was claiming that she'd been the mastermind, that he'd just been a weak husband going along with his domineering wife's plans, that he'd never actually intended for me to die. Arthur asked what I wanted to do. I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted Derek to face the full consequences of his actions, but another part, the part that had raised him, that had loved him for 53 years, knew that Melissa had been the driving force. Derek was weak and greedy and cowardly, but Melissa was the one who'd actually poisoned me. She was the one who'd searched how to kill elderly people, and then methodically tried to do it. I told Arthur that Derek could testify, but I wanted conditions. He'd served time, not as much as Melissa, but enough to understand the gravity of what he'd done. And I wanted him to allocate a portion of any future earnings to elder abuse prevention programs, if he was going to profit from his story in any way, and criminals always seem to find ways to profit. Then some of that money needed to go toward helping other vulnerable elderly people. Arthur said he'd negotiate those terms. Meanwhile, Sandra had been investigating something else that I'd asked her to look into. If Melissa had been researching how to kill elderly people for months, had she done this before? Did she have a history I didn't know about? What Sandra found made my blood run cold all over again. Melissa's maternal grandmother had died 3 years ago, at age 81, from what was ruled a medication error. She'd been taking similar medications to mine, blood thinners, blood pressure medication, and had accidentally taken too much. At least, that's what the death certificate said. Melissa had been her primary caregiver in the final 6 months of her life. Sandra couldn't prove anything. It was too long ago. The body had been cremated. There was no evidence left to examine. but the parallels were chilling. An elderly woman on multiple medications, a young relative managing her pills, a sudden death attributed to medication overdose. Had Melissa killed her own grandmother? Had she gotten away with it once and decided to try again with me? I'd never know for sure. But it changed how I thought about everything. This wasn't just about desperation and debt. Melissa might have been a serial killer targeting elderly family members for inheritance money. Arthur said we couldn't bring the grandmother's death into the trial without proof, but the district attorney's office was looking into it. If they found anything, any evidence at all, Melissa would face additional charges. 2 weeks after the arrests, Derek tried to contact me. He sent a letter. His lawyer probably advised against direct contact, but Derek had never been good at following advice. The letter was 6 pages long, handwritten, full of apologies and excuses and justifications. He claimed he'd been drowning in debt and depression after losing his job. He said Melissa had preyed on his weakness, manipulated him, convinced him that I was old and wouldn't mind dying if it meant my children could be financially secure. He said he'd never actually believed she'd go through with it, that he thought it was just desperate talk. But then he wrote something that made me crumple up the letter and throw it across the room. He said that when I reached 80, or 85, or 90, wouldn't I want to go peacefully in my sleep rather than lingering in decline? Wasn't there some mercy in what Melissa had planned? Wasn't it, in some twisted way, a kindness? My own son was trying to convince me that attempted murder was a favor. I didn't respond to the letter. Arthur advised against any contact anyway, said it could complicate the trial. But even if he hadn't, I had nothing to say to Derek. There were no words for the betrayal. No way to bridge the gap between a mother who'd given everything and a son who'd decided her death would be convenient. Linda came over almost every day during those weeks. She'd bring groceries, help me around the house, just sit with me while we drank tea and didn't talk about Derek. I could see the guilt eating at her. She kept saying she should have noticed something was wrong, should have seen the warning signs, should have protected me. But how could she have known? How could any of us have imagined that Derek and Melissa were capable of this? Marcus and James visited too, separately and together. James told me he'd confronted Derek, showed up at his house and demanded to know how he could do this to his own mother. Derek had apparently broken down crying, saying he was sorry over and over, saying he wished he could take it all back. But you can't take back poisoning someone. You can't undo researching how long your mother is likely to live so you can calculate when you'll get paid. You can't unring that bell. 3 weeks after the arrests, Arthur called with news. The district attorney's office had finished their investigation and was moving forward with formal charges. Melissa was being charged with attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse with intent to cause death, and illegal entry. They were asking for 15 years minimum. Derek, because of his cooperation agreement, was being charged with conspiracy to commit murder and elder abuse. The prosecutor was recommending 3 years with possibility of parole after 18 months. 3 years, for helping plan his mother's murder. It seemed like nothing, but Arthur explained that with Derek's testimony, they had an airtight case against Melissa. Without it, she might only get 5 to 7 years, maybe less, with good behavior. Derek's betrayal of his wife was actually serving justice, even if it was motivated by self-preservation rather than remorse. I asked Arthur when the trial would be. He said probably 4 to 6 months, depending on court schedules and how many motions Melissa's lawyer filed. He warned me it would be difficult, that I'd have to testify. That Melissa's defense would try to paint me as a manipulative old woman who'd entrapped her innocent daughter-in-law. Let them try. I had evidence that would bury that defense so deep it would never see daylight. That night, sitting alone in my house, I thought about the moment everything had changed. Not the birthday party, that was just when I'd learned the truth. The real change had happened months earlier, maybe years earlier, when Derek had started seeing me as an obstacle instead of his mother. When had that shift occurred? Was it when he lost his job and needed money? Was it the first time Melissa mentioned my age like it was an expiration date? Or had it always been there, some seed of resentment or greed that just needed the right circumstances to grow? I'd never know the answer. Some questions don't have good answers, especially questions about why the people you love decide to hurt you. But I did know one thing with absolute certainty: I wasn't going to let this destroy me. Melissa had tried to kill my body, and Derek's betrayal had tried to kill my spirit, but I was still here, Still breathing, still thinking, still fighting. At 79 years old, I'd survived more than they'd ever thrown at me. And I'd survived this too. The trial date was set for early September. 4 months away. 4 months to prepare, to gather strength, to get ready to face my son and his wife in a courtroom and tell the world what they'd done. 4 months to prepare for the moment when I'd look them in the eye and show them exactly what this helpless old woman was capable of. They'd wanted to know why I was still alive. By the time I was done, they'd wished they'd never asked. September arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that always made me think of new beginnings. Funny, considering I was about to watch my son testify against his wife in a murder trial. The courthouse was smaller than I'd expected from watching television. Real courtrooms aren't dramatic or imposing. They're just rooms with uncomfortable benches and fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look sick. But when I walked in that first day, supported by Linda on one side and Marcus on the other, the weight of what was about to happen hit me like a truck. Melissa was already seated at the defense table with her lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s who'd apparently specialized in defending white-collar criminals. Melissa had lost weight in jail. Her hair, which she'd always worn perfectly styled, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked smaller, diminished, nothing like the confident woman who'd smiled at me while serving poisoned tea. When she saw me walk in, something flickered across her face. Not remorse, I'd learned to recognize that expression. And this wasn't it. It was calculation. Even now, even facing 15 years in prison, she was still trying to figure the angles. Derek wasn't in the courtroom yet. As a witness for the prosecution, he'd be brought in when it was time for his testimony. The jury selection had taken 3 days. Arthur had explained that they needed people who could understand elder abuse, who wouldn't dismiss my story as family drama or think that attempted murder was somehow less serious because the victim was old. We ended up with 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 64. 3 of them had elderly parents in their lives. That was good for our side. The prosecutor was a woman named Jennifer Chen, early 40s, with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in elder abuse cases. She'd lost her own grandmother to financial exploitation by a caregiver, and Arthur said she took these cases personally. When she approached me during a recess on the first day, she looked me in the eye and promised she'd fight for me like I was her own family. I believed her. The trial opened with Jennifer's statement to the jury. She laid out the case methodically. A 79-year-old woman, widowed and vulnerable, targeted by her own son and daughter-in-law for her life savings. She described the birthday party conversation, the systematic poisoning, the fake concern, masking murderous intent. She told the jury that this wasn't a case of family members having difficult conversations about end of life care. This was cold-blooded attempted murder motivated by greed. Melissa's lawyer, Catherine Walsh, gave a very different opening statement. She painted me as a manipulative matriarch who'd set up an elaborate scheme to punish a daughter-in-law she'd never liked. She suggested that I'd misinterpreted casual conversations, that the medications were simply mistakes made by someone trying to help, that I'd staged evidence and recordings to frame an innocent woman. It was impressive, actually. If I didn't know the truth, I might have believed her. The first week of trial was mostly technical testimony. Sandra took the stand and explained the surveillance equipment, how the cameras were installed, how the recordings were stored and secured. The defense tried to argue that the surveillance violated Melissa's privacy, but Arthur had made sure every warrant was perfect. The evidence was admissible. Then came the toxicology experts. 3 different specialists testified about the medications, how warfarin overdose works, what happens when you combine blood thinners with sleeping pills, how the dosages found in my pill organizer and in that cup of tea would have affected someone my age with my medical conditions. One doctor said plainly that the tea mixture would have killed me within 12 hours. Probably 6. I watched the jury's faces during that testimony. Several of them looked at Melissa with expressions that told me they were already convinced. The second week, they played the recording from my birthday party. The entire thing. All 15 minutes. The courtroom was dead silent except for Melissa's voice asking why I was still alive, discussing medication overdoses, planning my death like a grocery list. When it finished, Jennifer Chen let the silence sit for a moment. Then she asked the jury a simple question. Does that sound like casual conversation to you, or does that sound like conspiracy to commit murder? Melissa's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Then came Derek's testimony, and this was what I'd been dreading most. They brought him in wearing a suit I recognized. I'd bought it for him 3 Christmases ago. He wouldn't look at me as he walked to the witness stand. He was sworn in, confirmed his identity, and Jennifer Chen began her questioning. She started easy, asked him about his financial situation, about losing his job, about the debt he and Melissa had accumulated. Derek answered quietly, admitting to all of it. He sounded broken, defeated, nothing like the confident son I'd raised. Then Jennifer asked him about the birthday party conversation. Derek confirmed he'd been there, that he'd heard everything on the recording. He said Melissa had been talking about it for months before that day, asking him how much longer I'd likely live, suggesting that they could speed things up. He admitted he'd gone along with it. He said he'd been desperate, drowning in debt, terrified of losing everything. He said Melissa had convinced him it would be mercy, that I was old and wouldn't want to linger, that we'd all be better off if I passed peacefully in my sleep. Peacefully, as if poisoning was peaceful. Jennifer asked if he'd known Melissa was actually tampering with my medications. Derek hesitated, then admitted he'd suspected but hadn't asked questions. He said he'd been a coward, that he'd let himself believe Melissa was just talking, just venting, not actually doing anything. But then Jennifer played him a text message from his phone, one we hadn't shown at the family dinner, sent to Melissa 2 days after she'd first organized my medications. Is it working yet? Derek had no answer for that. He sat there, silent, while the implication hung in the air. He'd known she was poisoning me, and he'd wanted updates on whether I was dying fast enough. The defense tried to rehabilitate him on cross-examination, suggesting he was a devoted son who'd made mistakes under financial pressure and his wife's manipulation. But Jennifer had destroyed his credibility. The jury knew he'd been complicit. When Derek finally stepped down, he walked past my seat. For just a second, our eyes met. I saw grief there, and shame, and something that might have been regret. But it was too late for any of that to matter. The third week brought the surveillance footage, hour after hour of Melissa entering my home without permission, photographing my documents, tampering with medications, researching how to kill elderly people on her laptop while sitting at my kitchen table. The most damning clip was from the day she'd brought the poisoned tea. The camera had captured her in my kitchen, alone, thinking I was out at a doctor's appointment. She'd pulled a small bottle from her purse, measured out pills, crushed them, and stirred them into the tea she'd prepared. Then she'd waited for me to come home, greeted me with hugs and concern, and watched me drink it. The footage showed her face as I sipped that tea. She looked, satisfied, almost excited. Jennifer Chen paused the video on that expression and asked the jury to consider what they were seeing. Not an accident. Not a mistake. Deliberate, premeditated attempted murder, captured on camera. Finally, it was my turn to testify. I'd been preparing for this for months, going over my story with Arthur and Jennifer, until I could recite it in my sleep. But walking to that witness stand, raising my hand to swear to tell the truth, looking out at the courtroom full of strangers and family and the woman who'd tried to kill me, nothing could have prepared me for that. Jennifer asked me to tell my story from the beginning. So I did. I told them about the birthday party, about hearing Melissa's voice through my window, about the shock of realizing my family was discussing my death like a financial transaction. I told them about recording the conversation, about finding Arthur and Sandra, about the surveillance and the fake will and the elaborate trap we'd set. I told them about pretending to take poisoned pills while knowing each one could kill me, about acting confused and dizzy while my daughter-in-law watched with barely concealed hope, about drinking that tea and seeing satisfaction in Melissa's eyes when she thought I was swallowing my own death. And I told them how it felt to be 79 years old and have someone ask why you're still alive, as if your continued existence was an inconvenience that needed to be resolved. The courtroom was absolutely silent when I finished. Melissa's lawyer tried to break me down on cross-examination. She suggested I'd misunderstood casual conversation, that I'd been paranoid and vindictive, that I'd created this entire scenario to punish a daughter-in-law I'd never liked. I looked her straight in the eye and asked if she'd listened to the recordings. I asked if accidentally doubling someone's blood thinner and adding sleeping pills to their tea was something that happened by mistake. I asked if researching how long does warfarin overdose take to kill someone was casual curiosity. She had no good answers. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I walked past Melissa. She was staring at me with pure hatred, and I realized she didn't regret trying to kill me. She regretted failing. The closing arguments came on a Friday afternoon. Jennifer Chen reminded the jury of everything they'd seen and heard: the recordings, the surveillance, the expert testimony, the poisoned medications, the elaborate planning. She said this was one of the clearest cases of attempted murder she'd ever prosecuted. Melissa's lawyer made one last attempt to create reasonable doubt, suggesting the evidence had been manipulated by a vindictive old woman with too much money and not enough love for her family. But I could see from the jury's faces that they weren't buying it. Deliberations took 6 hours. When the jury came back with their verdict, my hands were shaking so badly that Linda had to hold them still. The forewoman stood and read the decision: guilty on all counts. Attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse with intent to cause death, illegal entry. Melissa's face crumbled. She started crying, not the tears of someone who regretted their actions, but the tears of someone who'd been caught and couldn't escape consequences. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later, but indicated he was inclined to follow the prosecution's recommendation of 15 years minimum. 15 years. Melissa would be 56 when she got out, assuming she served the full sentence. I'd be 94 if I lived that long, and I planned to live that long, just to spite her. Melissa was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 10. The judge said her actions represented a particularly cruel exploitation of an elderly person's trust and vulnerability. He said she'd shown no remorse, only anger at being caught. He said she was a danger to any elderly person who might have the misfortune of being related to her. Derek was sentenced 3 weeks later, after his cooperation was factored in. 3 years, with possibility of parole after 18 months. He'd also been ordered to pay restitution and contribute to elder abuse prevention programs upon release. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Derek stood up and looked directly at me for the first time since the trial began. He told me he was sorry. He said he'd spent every night in jail thinking about what he'd done, about how he'd betrayed the woman who'd given him everything. He said he knew I'd never forgive him and he didn't deserve forgiveness. He said he hoped that someday, somehow, he could become the man I'd raised him to be instead of the monster he'd become. I didn't respond. I just sat there, looking at my firstborn son, and felt absolutely nothing. Not anger anymore, not grief, not even disappointment. Just emptiness where love used to be. Maybe that's what hurts most about this whole thing. Not that they tried to kill me, though that certainly hurt, but that they killed something else in the process. They killed the mother who would have done anything for her children. They killed the grandmother who baked cookies and told stories and loved unconditionally. That woman died the day I heard Melissa ask why I was still alive. What replaced her was someone harder, wiser, less trusting. Someone who understood that family didn't mean safety and love, didn't guarantee loyalty. I'm not sure if that's better or worse than being dead. After the sentencing, I revised my will with Arthur's help. Derek receives exactly $10,000, enough to restart his life when he gets out of prison. But nowhere near enough to justify what he'd done. The letter accompanying his inheritance explains that this is what his mother's life was worth to him. The difference between financial comfort and a modest restart. My other 3 children split the remainder of the estate equally. Linda, Marcus, and James had stood by me through everything. They deserved to benefit from the life their father and I had built. But before any of that gets distributed, $300,000 goes to establish the Vivian Ashford Foundation for Elder Protection. It provides legal assistance, private investigation services, and support for elderly people who suspect they're being exploited or endangered by family members. Arthur serves on the board. Sandra runs the investigative division, and I'm the face of it, the grandmother who refused to be a victim. We've helped 43 elderly people in the 8 months since the foundation launched. 43 people who heard my story and realized they weren't paranoid, weren't confused, weren't imagining things. 43 people who were being targeted by family members who saw them as ATMs with expiration dates. We've prevented 6 potential murders that we know of. 6 elderly men and women who would have died accidentally if someone hadn't helped them gather evidence and involve law enforcement. 6 families torn apart by greed, just like mine. It doesn't make what happened to me worth it. Nothing could make that worth it. But at least something good came from the worst experience of my life. I turned 80 last June. 80 years old, the age Melissa seemed to think was too old to justify continued existence. I celebrated with Linda, Marcus, James, and their families. We had cake and presents and laughter, and nobody asked why I was still alive. Because I'm alive for the same reason everyone is alive, because my time hasn't come yet. Because I have more life to live, more love to give, more things to see and do and experience. My age doesn't diminish that. If anything, it enhances it. I've earned every one of these 80 years, and I'll be damned if I let anyone tell me I've had enough. I travel now. Last fall I went to Italy, something my husband and I always planned to do but never got around to. I stood in front of the Trevi Fountain and cried because he should have been there with me, and because I was there despite everything that tried to stop me. I give talks at senior centers and community organizations, telling my story and teaching elderly people how to protect themselves. I show them warning signs of financial exploitation and abuse. I teach them about documenting conversations, about keeping their legal and financial information secure, about trusting their instincts when something feels wrong. Most importantly, I tell them they have value, that their lives matter. That age doesn't make them disposable or less worthy of respect and protection. Because that's what Melissa and Derek really stole from me. Not my money, I still have that. Not my life, I'm still breathing. They stole my sense of safety in my own family. They stole the grandmother I used to be, the one who believed love was enough. But in return, I became someone stronger. Someone who understands that survival sometimes means fighting the people you love. Someone who knows that being 79, or 80, or 90, doesn't mean being helpless. Derek writes to me from prison every few months. Long letters full of apologies and self-recrimination, and promises to do better. I don't respond. Arthur advises against it legally, but honestly, I just don't know what I'd say. How do you respond to your son telling you he's sorry for trying to kill you? What words exist for that particular betrayal? Melissa hasn't written. I suspect she still thinks I'm the villain in this story, that I somehow wronged her by refusing to die on her schedule. My grandchildren ask about their father sometimes. Derek's daughter, Emily, is 12 now. She wants to know why Grandma won't visit Daddy in prison, why everything changed, why Christmas isn't the same anymore. I tell her a simplified version of the truth, that her father made some very bad choices that hurt people, and he has to face the consequences of those choices. I tell her that loving someone doesn't mean accepting everything they do, and that sometimes the people we love disappoint us in ways we can't forgive. She's too young to understand it fully. Maybe when she's older, when she's learned more about how complicated families can be, she'll understand why her grandmother couldn't forgive attempted murder just because it came from her son, or maybe she'll think I'm cruel and unforgiving. I can live with that. I've learned a lot about myself in the past year and a half. I've learned I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient, more capable of surviving betrayal. I've learned that decades of motherhood don't obligate me to martyr myself for children who see me as an obstacle. I've learned that age brings wisdom, and sometimes that wisdom is knowing when to fight and when to walk away, and when to build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed. Most importantly, I've learned that I'm not done yet. Melissa asked why I was still alive, like my continued existence needed justification, like I was supposed to apologize for taking up space past 79. I'm still alive because I choose to be, because I have a foundation to run, and people to help, and grandchildren to love, and trips to take, and stories to take, and stories to tell. I'm still alive because my life has value, and that value doesn't decrease with age. I'm still alive because I refuse to let greed and betrayal and attempted murder define my final chapters. And I'm still alive to tell this story, to reach other people who might be facing what I faced, who might need to know that being old doesn't mean being helpless. If this story touched you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And please, subscribe to this channel, because there are so many stories like mine that need to be told. Stories of elderly people who fought back, who survived, who refused to be victims just because someone decided they were too old to matter. Every grandmother, every grandfather, every elderly person has lived an entire life full of experiences and wisdom and strength. We're not burdens, we're not obstacles, we're not inconveniences waiting to be resolved. We're human beings who've earned our place in this world, and we deserve to live out our days with dignity, respect, and safety. I'm Vivian Ashford, I'm 80 years old, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, alive, thriving, and ready for whatever comes next. Because when someone asks why I'm still alive, the answer is simple. Because I can be. Because I want to be. Because my story isn't over yet. And it won't be over until I decide it is, on my terms, surrounded by people who love me genuinely, not people counting the days until they can collect their inheritance. That's why I'm still alive. That's why I'll keep living. And if my story helps even one person recognize the warning signs in their own family, if it saves even one life, then everything I went through will have meant something. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And please, if you know an elderly person in your life, let them know they matter. Let them know their age is an accomplishment, not an expiration date. We all deserve to live our full lives, every precious year of them, even especially when we're 79 and someone wonders why we're still breathing.